One signature in Washington, one shockwave in Detroit. A new game led by Canada. On June 4, 2025, the U.S. President announced a 50% tariff on imported steel and aluminum. A decision seemingly meant to protect domestic industry, but one that quickly paralyzed American production lines, wiped out jobs, while Canada turned the crisis into a historic push to dominate the global green steel game. The tariff wall and Detroit's paralysis. June 4, 2025, began like any other day in Washington. Light sunshine, beltway traffic thick as ever, and crowds brushing past each other in the seemingly unchanging churn of politics. But a single new sentence in the Federal Register shook the foundations of America's steel industry. A 50% tariff officially imposed on imported steel and aluminum. No sirens blared, no loud press release followed. This strike from the White House was a silent but precise punch, aimed directly at the heart of America's industrial supply chain. Why steel? Because steel isn't just metal. It's the backbone of everything: bridges, cars, oil pipelines, and even the nameless screws holding national infrastructure from collapse. When the administration chose steel as a political battlefield, it meant betting the entire life force of manufacturing on a tariff gamble. But this time, instead of erecting a protective shield as before, the White House unwittingly built a wall blocking the flow of steel that Detroit and millions of American workers can't live without. Less than 24 hours after the order, phones at corporate offices from Cleveland to Monterey rang off the hook. Old calculations instantly became worthless. A ton of hot-rolled steel imported on Tuesday would cause major losses by Wednesday. Suppliers pulled back quotes. Contracts in progress were suspended, and in Detroit's factories, robotic arms that had moved tirelessly on assembly lines fell suddenly silent, as if someone had cut power to the entire system. This wasn't just a technical glitch. It was the moment American industry realized it had handcuffed itself. A week earlier, U.S. steel prices hovered around $700 a ton. Post-tariff, the number shot up to $900, and that was the floor, not yet counting shipping costs or the scarcity spreading like a virus. With each F-150 requiring about a ton of steel to take shape, Ford, the maker of America's beloved pickup, had to shoulder an extra $500 million just to feed steel before a single frame could be welded. But the shock wasn't just in the numbers. It showed in the eyes of night shift workers told to go home for now. In local news reports announcing factory shift cuts and delayed orders. In the tense silence of executive offices where no one could say for sure whether this price spike would stop or had only just begun. The 50% tariff order was designed to protect the domestic steel industry, a noble ambition on paper. But in reality, the U.S. steel sector had long lost its edge in cost, technology, and environmental standards. The aging blast furnaces in the Rust Belt, running on coal, couldn't compete with Canada's electric arc furnace steel or low-carbon steel from Europe. So when Washington raised trade barriers instead of pushing foreign steel out, it unintentionally imprisoned its own demand inside. And when that demand isn't met, consequences spread like dominoes. No steel, no production, no cars rolling off the line, no revenue. No revenue means layoffs, delayed payments, shuttered branches. A negative spiral began, and this time, the epicenter wasn't a pandemic, but a self-imposed economic order. Americans began to feel the shift in the most obvious places: higher car prices, fewer choices, longer wait times. But the cold numbers on Wall Street's tickers reflected another truth. The S&P fell nearly 1% on the day the order was announced. Investors called it a Trump session teaser, a preview of the coming wave of instability. Today's world is no longer a unipolar playground where the U.S. sets the rules. In a tightly interlinked global economy, every move from Washington triggers aftershocks not always within its control. And in this case, those aftershocks are boomeranging back to the very states once symbolic of American industry, with halted lines, cold furnaces, and the dream of Made in America under serious question. One executive order, one signature, one number, 50%. But the real cost could be millions of livelihoods, billions of dollars, and America's place in the global supply chain. And this was only the first day. The rebuttal from Hamilton. When Detroit fell silent, Hamilton blazed. Just a few hours after Washington imposed a 50% steel tariff, freight trains crossing the northern border began to halt. Without any official order from Ottawa, Canada's metallurgical mills understood the message clearly. The old game was over, and a new set of rules was beginning. And this time, Canada was no longer the dependent party. For a long time, over 90% of Canada's steel exports flowed toward the United States. It wasn't a choice, it was a default, a historical dependence on the massive market across the border. Canadian companies produced to American standards, priced in U.S. dollars, and operated as an extension of America's industrial supply chain. But once the tariff proclamation was signed, that no longer held true. That system was severed with a single stroke of ink on paper. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't waste time with criticism. At an emergency press conference on the afternoon of June 4th, he did not avoid strong language. This is Washington's own goal, a strike straight at the engine of America's manufacturing. But that statement was more than outrage. It was a declaration of sovereignty. Canada would no longer serve as a spare parts warehouse for an unstable neighbor. If the U.S. built barriers, Canada would prioritize its own domestic supply. At the same moment, a series of strategic decisions originated from the federal government's offices. All national infrastructure projects, from new highways in Saskatchewan to regional rail lines in Alberta, would now be required to use Canadian-made steel. Not a single American-made steel beam was on any bid list. New orders all pointed to Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, and the industrial regions along Lake Ontario. That very night, the lights at Hamilton's blast furnaces, silently dimmed for years by declining demand, flares up again as if in wartime. No longer destined for Detroit, Canadian steel now sought routes to Europe, Asia, and even South America. In the blazing orange glow of molten iron and steel, a new strategy was forged ton by ton: independence and commercial sovereignty. But Canada's response wasn't just policy, it was speed. While the U.S. Congress was still tangled in interstate disputes, Prime Minister Carney was on site, shaking hands with workers at the Arcelor-Mittal Dofasco plant, now taking export orders bound for South Korea and Belgium instead of Michigan. In a sharply succinct speech, he emphasized, "If the U.S. wants to build walls, we will build bridges to markets that value stability." No one expected that just 1 week after the steel tariff order, Canada would shift from reactive to proactive. No longer waiting on orders from Detroit, Canadian steel businesses, from giants like Stelco to small rolling mills across Ontario, activated expansion plans in unison. Ports in Montreal, Quebec, and Vancouver brimmed with steel coil containers. Shipments headed directly to Busan, Rotterdam, and Genoa for the first time, places where Made in Canada had never been a familiar label in steel. International analysts were stunned. How could a country so nearly wholly dependent on the U.S. pivot strategy so rapidly? The answer isn't magic. It was preparation. For years, Canada quietly watched the rising trend of U.S. protectionism, from the first Trump administration to upheavals under Biden. And though they couldn't predict the exact day, they knew one day Washington would shut the door. So when that door slammed, Canada didn't panic. They already had a handle on the other side. Canada's leadership didn't hide its ambition to transform crisis into opportunity, turn domestic market into priority, and become an indispensable partner in the new global supply chain, one defined by stability, low emissions, and responsibility. In an age when the unpredictability of U.S. policy increasingly unnerves partners, Canada aims to play the role of a trusted friend, even at the cost of building that trust firmly over time. That night in Hamilton, the furnace fires still burned bright, but this time it wasn't to keep Detroit warm. It was to recast Canada's position on the global steel trade map, once more, but on their own terms. From red steel to green steel. If Canada's initial response was a strategic reflex, swift, decisive, intended to stop the bleeding from its domestic manufacturing, what followed was something entirely different, a visionary reinvention, where steel was not just an industrial material, but a symbol of a new energy era. And this time, Canada didn't just want to remain a supplier, they wanted to lead the way. Early on July 16th, less than 2 weeks after freight cars full of steel withdrew from the U.S. border, Prime Minister Mark Carney reappeared, not at a blast furnace, but at a major announcement in Toronto. He declared a public investment of $1 billion Canadian dollars, not to restore traditional coal-fired blast furnaces, but to dismantle them. The plan, named Canadian Steel Renaissance, is a clear commitment. The future lies not in coal, but in electricity and hydrogen. Ontario's plants will be converted to electric arc furnace, EAF, and direct reduced iron, DRI, technology powered by hydrogen, technologies that just a few years ago were a distant dream for heavy industry. But now, with a crisis from Washington as the catalyst, that dream was ignited by political determination. Why now? Because Canada understands it holds a trump card most of the world lacks: a nearly emission-free electricity grid. With 93% of its power coming from hydroelectric and nuclear energy, Ontario boasts one of the cleanest grids in the industrialized world. That means every ton of steel produced there, if made using electricity instead of coal, has almost no carbon footprint. And in a world about to enter an era of carbon border taxes, that is pure gold. In Brussels, European Union legislators are finalizing the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, a tool that will tax all imported goods based on the hidden carbon emissions in their production. Starting in 2026, every ton of steel entering the EU will incur a fee of nearly €90 if produced using coal, forcing many mills from Turkey, India, Brazil to cut exports or accept losses. But Canada does not face that problem. With a clean energy grid and a comprehensive transition plan, Canada is about to enter the European market equipped with a carbon passport, the new century's trade credential. In Hamilton, the transition plan is being put into action daily. The ArcelorMittal Dofasco plant, long seen as the symbol of Canada's steel industry, has started building a new DRI-EAF complex worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Once complete, it will fully replace traditional coal-fired blast furnaces, cutting more than 5 million tons of CO2 emissions annually. With electricity supplied from the Niagara Dam and Bruce Power Nuclear Station, steel from here will not only be cleaner, but also cheaper. This is not just an environmental issue. It's a competitive advantage. As automakers like BMW, Volkswagen, and Renault are forced to slash supply chain emissions to meet EU regulations, they cannot contract with steelmakers still using coal-fired furnaces. Meanwhile, a CBA-ready coil from Hamilton, labeled low emission and backed by renewable energy, will be prioritized not just for quality, but for legal compatibility. While U.S. mills, most still fueled by coal and natural gas, struggle with cost and compliance, Canada silently positions itself as the sustainable steel hub of the Western Hemisphere. They don't need a revolution. They need a strategic leap, and that leap is happening minute by minute in Ontario. Inside strategic meetings in Ottawa, the tone has shifted, from saving supply chains to leading role, from domestic market priority to global influence expansion. When Prime Minister Carney described this plan as a permanent shift in axis, he was not only talking about steel, he was talking about standing, about Canada becoming a strategic supplier in a world increasingly selective, not just about price, but carbon footprint. When the fires burn in those green electric furnaces, the familiar image of a rusty industry disappears. What appears is a Canada in transformation, not avoiding global disruption, but harnessing it as leverage. And in every coil of steel coming out of Hamilton, there is not only metal, but a vision shaping the future. Power shift on the scale. There are moments in history when the map of power doesn't change through force or camera-ready handshakes, but through a quiet withdrawal. In 2025, just as America believed it was accelerating protection of domestic manufacturing with tariff walls, what was actually unfolding was a silent transfer of leadership, not to a traditional rival in Asia, but from the neighbor Washington once viewed as its default partner, Canada. But this time, Canada was no longer the country waiting for U.S. policy and adjusting in response. Instead, they transformed into the proactive party reshaping the rules, reconstructing supply chains, and, most critically, regaining initiative in the steel and aluminum industry that the U.S. had just shot itself in the foot. In a private meeting in Ottawa, Canada's Minister of Industry then, a former metallurgical engineer, did not talk about retaliation or negotiating tariff reductions. He presented a 47-page plan with the first handwritten line: "This is no longer a crisis, but an opportunity." That door opened not through protests or WTO complaints, but through speed. Within just 90 days after the U.S. imposed tariffs, Canada approved a $12 billion Canadian investment in hydrogen metallurgy infrastructure, collaborating with Norway, Germany, and Japan to transfer technology. Projects in Hamilton, Sault-Ste-Marie, and Saguenay were accelerated to build CO2-free production lines, something that mills in Ohio or Pennsylvania couldn't even dream of. At the same time, Canada's trade delegations appeared frequently in Brussels, Jakarta, Seoul, and New Delhi. No grand declarations, no complaints about lost jobs or exploitation, just respectful nods from countries seeking clean steel supplies to replace China. Meanwhile, the U.S. remained tangled in domestic disputes. Michigan lawmakers demanded tariff repeal after GM assembly plants halted due to material shortages. Unions in Alabama and Illinois protested rising steel prices, delaying infrastructure projects. But the White House could not immediately reverse a decision tied to the powerful protectionism image they had built for industrial voters. In reality, the tariff policy didn't save the U.S. steel industry. It exposed a cold truth. The sector had become too dependent on cheap flows and unwilling to innovate. Meanwhile, Canada, once the quiet supplier, had now transformed into the standard setter for global green steel. This power shift didn't require a summit. It unfolded in long-term contracts with the European Union, in Canada's pledged emission data, and in every rail line, building, and bridge worldwide through which Canadian steel quietly flowed. So, while the U.S. was busy trying to rescue its central role by tweaking tariffs or calling for renegotiations, Canada, the neighbor once relegated to the sphere of influence, had taken the first step and quietly closed the door behind. When power is redefined not by volume of voice, but by adaptability, when victory belongs not to the loudest, but to the quietly swift, then Canada had won, without having to declare it. Because economic history waits for no nation to catch up. It only honors those who dare to seize opportunity and turn crisis into beginning. And this time, the one who did that was a country known precisely for its humility, stepping out of the giant's shadow. While the world was still debating who would become America's next counterweight in the global trade order, China, the European Union, or even an alliance of developing nations, in the North, Canada chose a different path, not confrontational, not ostentatious, but resolute and intentional. And that path began with something very simple, stepping out of the shadow of the giant they once admired and also feared. There was a time when every policy shift from Washington forced Ottawa to weigh each move carefully. A single word from the White House could rattle Canada's markets. A nighttime tariff decree from D.C. could collapse the business plans of hundreds of Canadian companies by morning. That relationship was close yet asymmetrical, like a vine wrapped around a towering tree, sheltered yet constrained in its reach. But the 2025 trade upheaval, with unilateral tariff strikes, baseless anti-dumping investigations, and the U.S. withdrawal from multilateral commitments, became Canada's loudest wake-up call in decades. It wasn't merely about losing billions in exports. It was the aching question: if the America they believed was a strategic friend could become their biggest risk, then who was the real ally in an uncertain world? Canada's answer did not come through impassioned speeches, but through concrete action. They rebuilt trade agreements without the U.S., strengthened domestic supply chains with partners in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia. They created state-private investment funds to support domestic industry in technology transition. They established a trade early warning network where real-time data on U.S. tariff policy, supply disruptions, and market shifts are analyzed, allowing Canadian businesses to respond before a crisis truly hits. Notably, this strategic pivot did not create internal division in Canada. Instead, it became a new glue for national spirit. Polls in 2025 showed over 70% of Canadians agreed that the country needed to reduce dependence on the U.S. economy, a figure unprecedented in history. From CEOs in Toronto to farmers in Saskatchewan, a spirit of new economic independence was spreading. That does not mean Canada turned its back on the U.S. They remain neighbors and major trading partners. But from 2025 onward, that relationship was redefined. No longer a nation dependent on Washington's protection, but a country standing on its own 2 feet, negotiating from equality without supplication or hesitation. Like a child who once lived under the shelter of a big brother, Canada had reached the point of maturity and moved off that porch, not to confront, but to explore its true limits. And in that silent separation, they rediscovered the identity that generations had inadvertently let fade under the glow of the American dream. Because sometimes the boldest act isn't to oppose someone, but to dare to step out of a shadow too large to cast your own path. And Canada, without noise, did exactly that, silently rewriting the rules of the game. There are changes in history that do not arrive with gunfire, nor are they marked by grand treaties. They come quietly, like how Canada, amid geopolitical storms and trade instability, silently rewrote the rules of the game. Not through military power, not through sanctions, but through the ability to reorganize itself, turning a passive stance into an active one. In mid-2025, while the world focused on U.S.-China tensions, supply chain crises in the South China Sea, or uncertain elections in Europe, Canada did something few noticed but was a turning point. The country officially launched a multi-centered trade framework, not to replace the United States, but to reduce the singular influence of any one superpower on Canada's economic structure. In this new model, the U.S. became just one of many poles, standing on equal footing with Japan, the European Union, ASEAN, and several South American countries like Chile and Colombia. This move was not only symbolic, but it also brought about a series of practical consequences. From prioritizing investment in westward and southbound sea transport routes to shifting technology protection policies away from being entirely dependent on American standards. Trade contracts were rewritten with escape clauses, allowing Canada to automatically adjust the flow of goods if a major partner unilaterally changes its policies. This change occurred quietly but deeply, especially in the mindset of Canadian businesses. A CEO in the agriculture sector once shared, "Before, whenever Washington sneezed, we feared catching the flu. Now we've got our own vaccine." That metaphor wasn't just a figure of speech, it accurately reflected the strategic essence. Canada no longer waits for the U.S. to regulate the market, but has learned to spread out risk, proactively manage supply and demand, and build independent response capabilities. From the outside, these moves may seem small and quiet, but for Canada, they were page turns in a new book, where they're no longer labeled a dependent economy, but begin to act as a trusted intermediary, a vital link in a global economic network that is increasingly fragmented. Of course, every journey toward autonomy comes with trade-offs. Canada must now face fiercer competition and the risks of no longer taking shelter under the world's biggest protective umbrella. But perhaps it is precisely within such turbulence that one sees true character, not in maintaining balance on a familiar path, but in daring to step into uncharted territory, where the rules are no longer written by others. And so, in a world tugged by the ambitions of big players, there is one nation that chooses neither to flaunt its power nor to plunge into a tit-for-tat spiral, but simply to reset the board, on its own terms. No applause, no fireworks, but in that silence, a new order is quietly taking shape. Canada, once seen as a shoulder-to-shoulder economy, has proven that it can also be the one redrawing the map. There's no need to shout for everyone to hear. Just act deeply enough that no one can ignore you, when those who once followed begin to lead. No one expected that one day Canada, a country once accustomed to standing on the sidelines of major games, would become the place others turn to for lessons on how to survive in a world tilting on its axis. But that day has come. And it didn't arrive by miracle, but through the cracks of broken trust, and from a question Canadians ask themselves, if there's no one left to lean on, what will we stand on? That question rang louder than ever in the summer of 2025, when longtime allies began acting more like competitors. When Washington imposed tariffs on Canadian agricultural goods without warning, when cross-border natural gas projects were stalled by new regulations written overnight, when bilateral trade conferences turned into blame games instead of forums for consensus, Canada realized it could no longer play a game whose rules could be changed at any moment, and where it didn't hold the dice. It was then that something strange happened. Instead of stepping back, Canada stepped forward. Instead of demanding fairness from the powerful, it rebuilt a foundation of fairness for itself. Not only through new trade agreements, but through a far more intangible and enduring asset, the trust of other partners. While some countries sank into protectionism and disputes, Canada welcomed international businesses with commitments to stability, transparency, and long-term integrity. And so, from Tokyo to Berlin, from Santiago to Jakarta, people began to talk about Canada not as a small market dependent on the U.S., but as a reliable anchor in a world spinning out of control. Investors who once hesitated returned. Universities and research institutions began building independent networks in artificial intelligence, biomedical science, and green energy. Canada was no longer just an exporter of wheat and softwood. It became a source of new policy principles on how to govern in crisis, how to rebuild supply chains, and how to build credibility without boasting. Some say Canada never intended to be a leader, but it is precisely that humility, clarity, and resilience that earned the world's trust. While superpowers spiral into division and short-term calculation, it's nations like Canada, once lagging, once silent, that are slowly becoming the lighthouse in the fog of the 21st century. Because sometimes the loudest voice is not the most powerful one. The country with the most aircraft carriers is not the most sustainable one. True strength lies in standing firm when the winds shift, in keeping promises in games that are no longer fair, in stepping back to see the longer path. And now, as old doors close, Canada is no longer waiting quietly for negotiations. It is opening new paths, not loudly, but steadily. A path that, perhaps in the near future, the old ones who once led will turn back to see. Not to ask to join, but to relearn how to walk from a country that once quietly followed behind.